Paul Churchland is a philosopher who believes in eliminative materialism, which suggests that our thoughts and feelings are not separate from brain activity. If the self comes from the brain, then the brain damage or condition like amnesia and autism can change how we see our identity, showing that it is not fixed and can be affected by physical change in the brain.
Paul Churchland advocates for eliminative materialism, arguing that folk psychology is an outdated theory that should be replaced by a scientific understanding of the brain. They argue that as neuroscience advances, we will stop talking about mental states like beliefs and desires, and instead of describing human experiences in terms of brain activity, they have helped bridge philosophy and neuroscience, showing how brain science can inform discussions on free will, morality, and personal identity. Eliminative materialism is a philosophical perspective in the philosophy of mind that argues that common sense, mental concepts like beliefs, desires, and even consciousness are fundamentally flawed and will eventually be replaced by more accurate neuroscientific explanations. It is associated with philosophers like Paul Churchland and Patricia Churchland. The problem posed by this excerpt revolves around how the concept of identity can be understood within the framework of eliminative materialism, which suggests that mental states in the self are entirely the result of brain processes. The question asks, if the self is purely a result of brain activity, how do phenomena such as brain damage or neurodivergence, like amnesia or autism, challenge our understanding of personal identity? The impact of brain damage can result to identity changes. When brain damage occurs, the person's cognitive abilities, memory, or even personality can change significantly. This raises the question, if the self is a product of brain activity, how do we reconcile the sudden shift in identity when someone's brain functions are altered? This seems to suggest that identity is not fixed, but rather highly dependent on the specific configuration and functionality of the brain. Neurodivergence and identity. The autism. Individuals on the autism spectrum have neurological wiring that differs from what is considered typical. These differences can manifest in variations in social interaction, communication, and behavior. But it doesn't mean that the individual lacks a sense of self. However, the experience of identity might be very different. This raises the question, If the brain's configuration influences the self, then how do we account from differing self-concepts in the individuals with neurological conditions that don't involve memory loss or dramatic personality shift? Eliminative materialism, the concept of self. Eliminative materialism holds that concepts like the self, beliefs, and desires are outdated and misleading. In this view, the self isn't a thing, but rather an emerging result of neural processes that can be studied and understood in purely materialistic terms. However, the question remains, if the self is so fluid and dependent on the brain function, can we even talk about a coherent self after significant changes, like brain damage or neurodivergence? Do these changes imply a completely new self, or is this continuity? Eliminative materialism, fluidity of the self. Brain damage and neurodivergence might suggest that the self isn't as stable as some materialistic frameworks assume. Instead, they indicate that the self could be a dynamic and evolving system dependent on brain processes that can change due to a variety of factors. The continuity of the self. A major question to explore is whether continuity of the self can persist despite these changes. Is the self the same person before and after a brain damage? Or does the self fundamentally shift? If the self is purely brain activity, what does that say about identity across time? Does the person who experienced a significant alteration, like memory loss or personality changes, does it remain the same individual, or they become someone else entirely? In conclusion, this issue challenges the notion of a fixed, stable identity. Eliminative materialism suggests that the self is merely the product of brain processes, but brain damage and neurodivergence illustrate that this self can be dynamic and subject to change. This raises deeper philosophical questions about the nature of personal identity, continuity, and what truly means to be the same person over time.